Playing against light can frustrate a lot of players, but there are many ways to shut a light down without needing top tier aim. And as someone that has spent a lot of time on the light class, I can point out a thing or two based on my experience. Not understanding the mindset of a light player is probably the #1 thing that can hold someone back from countering them. And so the first half of this video will be about explaining that mindset, and the second half will be about how to use this mindset against a light player to counter them, along with some specific gadgets and weapons that pose a problem for lights. If you don't play light, you might not know how one approaches a match, and that's a major issue when you're trying to counter one. Since light has the lowest health in the game, someone playing as a light has to rely heavily on their movement and positioning to survive, which may be true for all classes, but light having the lowest health makes it that much more important. And if a light's opponents have very little awareness or counters to their playstyle, a light can get away with a lot more risky plays than they otherwise would against players that are more prepared. And if you're struggling against lights, the unaware player that I'm describing is likely you. A good light will always try to get some sort of advantageous position on their opponents in the form of an off angle or keeping their distance to catch people by surprise, only fully committing to a fight when there's little to no chance of losing. Until that point, they're likely to keep peeking in and out of cover with their back to an easily accessible exit to the fight, and if they have a gadget on hand such as a gateway or vanishing bomb, they of course may use those to help escape instead. Sometimes mistakes are made, and they'll fully commit to a fight only to lose, but that's the idea behind their motives and exit strategy. They'll also take advantage of mid-fight chaos to reposition and heal if a fight is going south, since the light class has faster self-healing compared to the other two classes. By the time they're healthy again, everyone else will still be slightly hurt, unless there's a healer nearby. When it comes to playing with your team, believe it or not, to play light well, it's almost a necessity. Just not in the way you may be thinking. A light will use their team as a distraction in some sense. While a heavier medium may approach a fight straight on, during that time, using their higher mobility, a good light will try to enter the fight from an angle that is less likely for them to gain attention. An angle where they can still help their team, or try to pick off a straggler. Against non-coordinated teams, stragglers are found quite often, and a good light will take advantage of this and pick them off, giving the light's team an early advantage in the fight. When a bad light tries this, it may leave you questioning what they're doing and why they're not playing with their team. Meanwhile, when it's done well, it can make their opponents question the same thing about their own team. Regardless of what specialization or build a light may be running, this is how they're played most effectively, at least at close to mid-range. If a light is using a sniper or any other form of long-ranged weapon, the positions a light will choose to sit will simply be where they can find the best line of sights to watch an objective, or the most likely paths for an opponent to take to get to an objective, repositioning only if they're being contested or if their line of sights gets blocked in some way. Another approach a light sniper may take is keeping their line of sights on their own team to do damage to whichever enemies their teammates may be shooting at. Both are effective ways to play, but one is more likely to keep your team alive, while the other will make it harder for an opponent to take an objective. These are my key takeaways I have from playing as a light and against good lights, and I can very well see how the way a light player approaches the game would be frustrating to play against, because it may appear as if they aren't playing with their team, but instead selfishly going after elims, and somehow getting away with it. Some players do legitimately play that way, but when taking the time to understand a good light's mindset, you may start to see that this is not always the case. To play light well, there's a somewhat calculated approach to every fight to make up for the lack of health, and their mobility and specializations play a big part in making that work. Now that I've gone through the general mindset of a light player, a few ideas may have popped into your head as to how to counter their playstyle. As I said just a moment ago, a light's mobility and specialization are a big part in what makes them work, and they use these two advantages to enter favorable fights. So these strengths will be what we need to weaken to counter them most effectively. If you know you're up against a light, there are some choices that can be made during a fight to indirectly decrease their mobility and increase your odds of success. Knowing that a light will not fully commit to an engagement unless it seems extremely advantageous, and will instead use their mobility to find off angles to chip away at your health, means as long as you're grouped with the rest of your team, and you have a way to limit off angles, whether that be goo, barricades, destroying zip lines, or something else entirely, you're less likely to get isolated and picked off. And one healer grouped with their team, or a well-placed dome shield, while not a perfect counter, can help reduce the likelihood of a light's chip damage from turning into chunk damage. If a light is forced to face your team head-on due to limited flank options, they'll have to strictly rely on their evasiveness and higher DPS to stay alive, rather than simply exiting the fight when things are going south. And at that point, strength in numbers, both health and player-wise, should give you a large advantage. For these type of winnable encounters to happen more frequently, you should also almost always avoid running through large open areas, as that's the most likely and easiest place for a light, or any class really, to wipe you out without giving you much of a fighting chance. Always try to path through buildings or areas with enough cover so that you won't die in an instant if you get spotted. This game gives you so many choices to create new pathways through obstacles. Take advantage of that when you can, to avoid going out in the open for too long whenever possible. And this should also help tremendously against lights playing at long ranges. The only exception to running in open areas is if everyone you're facing is running close range weapons, like melee weapons or shotguns. If you're in a position where you're forced to push into a team that has a light, just be aware that at some point they're likely to try and reposition to get behind you. In which case, the advice I gave earlier will still be relevant. Stick with your team and block off entry points when you can to limit their flank options, or at the very least be aware those flank options exist and take a glance at them every so often if an enemy light has gone missing. While blocking off pathways, staying grouped with your team, and avoiding open areas when possible are probably the best ways to counter lights, there are also many weapons and gadgets that can help turn things in your favor. Traps or mines, for example, can be a very annoying obstacle for a light, since one good hit from an explosive or pyro mine can wipe out over half of a light's health, and glitch traps render all of light's extra mobility options unusable, plus any form of invisibility. The moment you hear a vanishing bomb go off, it's a good habit to throw one down and hang around it until you think the invisibility is over. The same can be done against cloaking device, but it's less effective since that can be reactivated anyway. I've already mentioned dome shields earlier in the video, and the mesh shield is decent as well, but the dome is generally better since you still have the option to fight back after it's been thrown. The RPG is probably the best offensive gadget at the moment for dealing with a light, but there's no guarantee that won't change. At the time of making this video, the RPG is an easy to use gadget that does up to 100 damage if you get a good hit in, and while that won't one-shot a light, it forces them out of the fight or can finish them off if they're even slightly injured. Motion sensors are great for watching your back and can be more useful than just blocking off a pathway at times. As far as weapons go, there are a few different options. The less aim-intensive ones are the CL40, the flamethrower, and the sledgehammer. The CL40 and sledgehammer are great simply because they do so much damage in one hit, meaning a light will have to play around that knowledge to avoid an almost instant death. While the flamethrower is great because not only is it easy to aim with, but it also slows down how fast a light's natural health regeneration will start due to the burning effect. And for more aim-intensive choices, there's the Model 1887, the Pike, the Revolver, and the KS-23, all of which can take down a light with very few shots. Playing as a light against any of these weapons will force them to play much more cautiously, and if you get good enough with any of these weapons, lights will hardly be an issue anymore. The weapons and gadgets I've named off are probably the most useful for dealing with lights, but that doesn't mean other weapons and gadgets can't be used. Sometimes using a loadout you're already comfortable with is the play. Although if you aren't taking the time to understand a light's mindset and are choosing the same old loadout, then nothing has changed. And if you still can't seem to win fights against lights, queuing for a match while changing nothing is just asking for them to walk all over you. As one final tip, if nothing else I mentioned in this video seems to help, I recommend playing the light class yourself to understand what counters do the best. You may learn more from that experience than anything that was said in this video. You'll learn what pathing is good to take on light from first-hand experience of failures and successes, and once you have that knowledge, you can piece together how to counter someone else playing that way. I hope this guide helps, and thanks for watching.